Dawn breaks down a narrow cobbled street in a 13th century European town. The wooden shutters begin to creak open. Merchants and artisans are about to begin their day. The scent of baking bread mingles with the sharp tang of tanned leather and the yeasty aroma of ale. You see one stall. A baker is carefully weighing loaves of bread, mindful of the strict laws that could land him in a pillory if his loaves are too light. And across the way, a weaver's apprentice throws open the workshop windows, arranging bolts of cloth on the ledge to entice the early morning customers. Down the street a little, a tavern keeper stirs a cauldron of pottage and taps a fresh barrel of ale, all prepared for the day's patrons. Welcome to the bustling world of medieval small business. Today we're going to talk all about it. How exactly do you run a business in medieval times, specifically in the high Middle Ages of Europe? We'll step into the daily lives of the tavern keepers, artisans, the small merchants, and we'll take a look at how they operated, the rules they had to follow, the daily routines, dealing with customers, and the strategies that kept their enterprises alive. Now, it's a journey that's based in primary sources: laws, letters, guild rules, contemporary accounts, as if you're right there on the streets themselves. From the moment of a town's morning bell, a watchman's horn signals daybreak, to the closing of the shop at dusk, you'll learn about the rhythms that guided these early entrepreneurs. So we'll try to maintain a balanced perspective today. We're not going to romanticize the past of some kind of golden age of honest craftsmen, but we'll also avoid the stereotype of the greedy medieval merchant. That being said, it does come from somewhere. Instead, we'll do a bit of a nuanced picture. It's a world of hard work, tight regulation, but also communal trust, along with some clever tactics of survival. Whether it's a Parisian guild ordinance, an English town charter, or just the personal recollection of a medieval alewife, it's these kinds of sources that are going to shed light on how people really made a living centuries ago. So let's step back into a time when business might mean selling ale by the pint, shoes by the pair, or cloth by the ell. Success depended on not just profit, but reputation, cooperation, and adhering to a just price. Allow me to welcome you to the channel first. For those newcomers, I hope you're excited, so excited that you click the like and subscribe button. And how about you tell me from whence ye hail, if we're sticking with the theme of the video. And thank you for those supporting on the Patreon and the merchandise store. You have my thanks. Now, with all that out of the way, let us now begin. Go back to the medieval grind. Small businesses in the Middle Ages flourished primarily in towns, which by the 11th to 13th centuries had become growing hubs of commerce. Towns gained special status through charters that granted residents rights favorable to trade. Just one example, the Charter of Loris of 1155 in France freed townspeople from many feudal dues and allowed use of communal mills and ovens. Such privileges attracted merchants and artisans to settle long-term and eventually open up shops of their own. The town marketplace was the center of daily business. Weekly market days brought in peasants selling produce and peddlers with imported wares, while permanent shops began to line the streets for everyday trade. Town authorities closely regulated market activity to keep it fair and orderly. Weights and measures were standardized, and practices like forestalling, that is, buying up the goods before they reached the market to drive up prices, were outlawed. In fact, a forestaller caught in England could be fined or put in the pillory, and you do not want to be put in the pillory. Prices of essential goods were sometimes fixed by law for fairness. The assize of bread and ale in the 13th century England is a famous example of that. It set the price at which a loaf of bread of a given weight must be sold, and ensured that ale was sold at a reasonable price per volume. Officials known as ale tasters and bread weighers would inspect taverns and bakeries to enforce the standards. Imagine getting a job as an ale taster. Now that could be interesting by the end of the day. But guilds, they also shaped the town economy. These were associations of tradespeople, kind of like how we have unions these days, but a little bit more specialized. We're talking carpenters, bakers, even cloth weavers, and they regulated their own members. Guilds set up rules for who could practice a trade. Often one had to complete a long apprenticeship and be accepted as a master. They also controlled the quality of products and fixed certain prices or wages. In Paris, for instance, the guild statutes compiled by Etienne Beaulieu in the 1260s detailed strict standards for each craft. Guild rules aimed to prevent fraud and unfair competition. For example, bakers, they had to bake bread of the proper weight, and if they didn't, they would face fines. Weavers, too, they were limited in how many looms they could operate, so that no single weaver could corner the market and gain a monopoly. But the guilds also provided support. If a member fell ill or died, the guild might step in and help out their family. It fostered a sense of solidarity among local business people, and if you were doing business, you pretty much had to be in the guild. So within this framework of charters, market laws, and guild regulations, medieval small businesses found opportunities to thrive. Towns offered a concentrated customer base and a relative freedom, unlike the peasants tied to manors. At the same time, business owners had to navigate the rules, paying town tolls, respecting the just price ideal, a moral expectation not to overcharge, and maintaining a good standing in their guild and community. So this was the world in which our medieval tavern keepers, artisans, and merchants lived and worked. A world governed by both economic necessity, sure, but also communal norms. After all, everyone knows everyone. So let's talk about some things in particular. We'll start in the artisan's workshop, a bit of a blanket term, crafting things for a living. A maker. And I want you to imagine a medieval artisan, say a cloth weaver, perhaps a shoemaker, starting his day. At first light, his apprentices unlatched the wooden shutters of the workshop, opening the front of the shop to the street. They set out goods on a bench, jutting out underneath the overhanging second floor, displaying rolls of freshly woven cloth or fine leather shoes, drawing the eyes of the early customers passing by. Inside, there is the master. He's finishing his morning prayers and a simple breakfast with his family. A town watchman's horn blows to signal the curfew is lifted. Trading can now begin. And once that horn sounds, the work commences promptly. In most towns, daylight defined the work hours. Guild ordinances actually forbade working by candlelight late at night, both to prevent accidents and to ensure quality. In fact, it was believed that no fine work could be done in the dim flicker of a lamp. And so the artisan works from dawn till dusk, with a break at midday for the main meal. In the workshop, everybody has roles. The master craftsman not only produces goods, but he supervises and teaches the others. Apprentices are young trainees, often boys in their teens, bound to the master for several years to learn that trade. They fetch materials, tend the fire, and practice basic tasks under close watch. And in return for all this, the master feeds them and gives them lodging, along with teaching them a craft that will serve them for the rest of their life. And so, after years of training, an apprentice might graduate to become a journeyman, a paid worker. Journeymen are skilled artisans who work for the master for daily wages. They can eventually attempt to become masters themselves if they save enough money to produce a masterpiece to prove their skill. Master, journeyman, and apprentices often all labored in the same room. In a 13th century Paris weaver's shop, an observer noted that the house was full of looms with the master, his sons, and hired workers, all busy at their stations. Now, medieval workshops, they were usually family businesses. The master's wife and daughters commonly participated. The wife might help run the shop front, or even do the bookkeeping, and daughters could assist in lighter tasks. In a weaving workshop, for example, women and girls did much of the spinning and thread preparation. In some trades, women could even be full-fledged artisans or guild members. Paris guild records show women exclusively ran certain crafts, and across Europe, a widow often continued her late husband's trade to support the family. Thus, one shouldn't picture the medieval shop as a all-boys club. It was often a family enterprise. Throughout the day, customers come and go. A housewife stops by the shoemaker's stall to order sturdy boots, or a mercer, a cloth vendor, visits the weaver to buy bolts of woolen cloth. All these interactions, face to face, very personal. The artisan's reputation for honesty and good workmanship, now that is critical. Haggling, that's common too. Buyer and seller negotiating prices. But outright cheating is strongly discouraged by both law and guild ethos. If an artisan tried to cheat a customer, for example, a baker using too little flour in a loaf, or a dyer watering down his dye, he risks severe penalties. Town authorities did not hesitate to make an example of dishonest traders. In London, for example, when bakers were caught secretly taking dough out of their loaves, shorting the weight, that is, they were sentenced to the public pillory, with the offending dough hung around their necks. Don't do it again. All their bread was confiscated and given to the poor. Now, such punishments sent a clear message: give customers fair measure. Well, I think we can have a look at some of the supermarket CEOs of our modern day and perhaps hang some dough around their necks, perhaps. But we don't want to get too political, don't we? Now, what about quality control? Well, that was enforced from within the craft. Guild wardens might inspect workshops, and a master could be fined by his guild for shoddy workmanship. Many guilds even required that workshop doors stay open during working hours so the public could see that no deceitful practices were underway. Think about the modern practice of having the glass kitchens, and that kind of thing. Certainly puts a lot of pressure on the chefs, though. like animals in a zoo. Maintaining a good reputation was perhaps the most important survival strategy. As Geoffrey Chaucer quipped in a satire, an honest miller was as rare as one with a golden thumb, since many would press a thumb on the scale to overcharge. And in a world without modern advertising, think about how important word of mouth really was. Medieval advice books often counseled merchants to be truthful and fair dealing for this very reason. Cheating one customer just one time, that could be enough to ruin your entire business in a small town. Well, dealing fairly, that built loyalty. And so, by sunset, the artisans wrap up the day. The shop front is closed, shutters latched, and perhaps an iron bar across the door, just in case. Not everybody is honest. The master might tally the day's earnings in a notebook, if they were literate, or simply by mental reckoning. If it looks good, it is good. Setting aside coins to pay his journeyman, of course, and to buy materials for the next week. If he sold goods on credit to a trusted neighbor, allowing them to pay later, a common practice, he notes that as well. Finally, the household gathers for the evening meal. It has been a long day of manual work and dealing with customers, but a pretty successful one, if they have met the guild's high standards and satisfied their clients. And so in a world without mass production, these small workshops, each pair of shoes, each bolt of cloth, made by hand, and they were essential to the community. The artisan's livelihood depended on skill, reputation, and the community's need, all under the watchful eye of the government and the guild. Of course, when you finish work, perhaps you'd go to the tavern. And running a medieval tavern, or ale house, well, that was another small business that required hard work, along with shrewd management. Many taverns were essentially the keepers' homes open to the public. In England, it was very common for women known as alewives or brewsters to run the alehouses themselves. And brewing ale was originally extension of the household work. Indeed, women brewed and sold most of the ale in the 13th to 14th century England. Only later, by the 15th century, did men begin to dominate the more large-scale commercial brewing of beer. A tavern keeper's day often began before sunrise with brewing. Ale in the Middle Ages was a fresh, unhopped brew that spoiled quickly, so it had to be made frequently and in small batches. In a simple alehouse, the wife might mash grain and set a new brew to ferment each morning, while also baking bread or cooking a pot of stew to serve to patrons. If the tavern doubled as an inn, the keeper also had to tend to any guests who spent the night, providing basic lodging, even just straw bedding on the floor, and some feed for the horses too. Even a small tavern would typically have a cauldron of pottage simmering and some barrels of ale ready by midday for the first customers. By afternoon and evening, local patrons arrived, villagers stopping in after work, travellers and pilgrims, a little bit hungry or a little bit thirsty, or perhaps merchants on their way through, looking to lodge overnight. One can imagine the tavern was certainly an interesting social hub. People exchanged news and gossip over drinks. Sometimes games like dice were played. A good tavern keeper was a genial host, but also a firm manager. Too much revelry, that could lead to trouble. And no one wants trouble in the tavern. Town laws often imposed a curfew, requiring taverns to close by a certain hour. For example, if the city bell rung out around 9 p.m., that was it for the day. If an alehouse got a reputation for brawls or late-night disorder, they could be shut down. Now, taverns were also subject to the same assize of bread and ale mentioned earlier. They had to sell ale of a certain quality at a fair price. To monitor this, officials called ale conners, or ale tasters, were appointed in towns. They would visit alehouses to inspect and taste the brew, ensuring it was good and wholesome, and sold at a proper price according to the law. If a tavern's ale was too weak, sour, or overpriced, the ale conner would report it to the local court. A tavern keeper found guilty of cheating customers, for instance by diluting ale or using false measure, could be fined or even forbidden from selling ale. This oversight meant medieval pub-goers expected a reasonably standard pint. The legendary image of a ale conner testing beer by sitting in a puddle of it on a bench to see if his leather breeches stuck is likely a later myth, but it's pretty funny, I think. It shows how seriously ale quality was taken. Despite regulations and oversight, running a tavern carried its own risks. The business depended on certain factors, like the price of grain, which could spike in a bad harvest year, and the quality of each brew, which could vary. A vivid example comes from the early 15th century. Marjorie Kemp, a townswoman of Lynn, England, attempted to run a brewing business of her own. She wrote that although she had a good equipment and good brewers, batch after batch of the ale was spoiling. Quote, when the ale had as fine a head as could be seen, suddenly the head would fall, and all the ale was lost. Her servants grew ashamed as every brew failed, and Marjorie ended up losing a great deal of money. She just couldn't get it right. Couldn't figure it out. Still happens in the modern day. People try and brew their own beer at home and they just can't quite get it. Well, Marjorie, she gave up brewing entirely. It just wasn't for her. As far as how she interpreted her business failure, well, as far as she was concerned, it was simply a sign of God's displeasure. Marjorie Kemp's tale, though colored through a spiritual perspective, it shows the precariousness of small entrepreneurs' fortunes. And just like in our modern era, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You gotta know when to hold them and fold them, don't you? One infection in the yeast, or a string of bad batches, could ruin a tavern's stock and reputation. So to survive, tavern keepers cultivated a loyal customer base. They often ran their taverns as a family operation, a husband and wife team, or a widow with help from grown children, ensuring personal attentive service. Regular patrons might be allowed to run a tab, a credit with their drinks, on the slate, as they used to say, to be paid later, which encouraged them to return, at least if they were good patrons. They'd better come back. Good tavern keepers also kept their establishments reasonably clean and welcoming, at least by the era's standards, and maintained good relations with local officials to keep their license secure and perhaps to get an advanced warning of any surprise inspections. At closing time, the tavern keeper shutters the windows and makes sure the hearth fire is safely banked. The day's earnings in coin accounted, some of which must be used to buy more malt and supplies for tomorrow's brew. Any ale left in the barrel that might sour by the morning could be given away or used in cooking, since it won't keep long. Like the artisan, the tavern owner lives day to day. A few good days of trade could be followed by a bad week if a local festival draws customers elsewhere, or if a traveling preacher convinces people to shun alehouse gluttony for a time. Yet, a well-run tavern was an indispensable part of the medieval community, a place to eat, drink, rest, and socialize. Through careful management of supply, adherence of regulation, and warm hospitality, tavern keepers managed to carve out a nice little livelihood, one cup of ale at a time. But not everyone shut up the shutters at the end of the day, fixed the iron bar. Not all medieval businesses had a fixed location. Many merchants were itinerant traders, traveling from market to sell goods. A peddler, settling out at dawn, with a pack on his back, or driving a small cart. He might carry a selection of items in demand by villagers. Think of pots and pans, knives, cloth, ribbons, spices, other little luxuries that are not quite made locally. These roving merchants, sometimes called chapmen in England, were a vital link between rural consumers and urban production centers. But travel in medieval times, that was strenuous, and it could also be dangerous. Our merchant has to contend with muddy roads and dense forests, and he must always be wary for bandits. When he reaches a town gate, he must usually pay a toll to enter with his goods. Upon arriving at the marketplace, he finds a spot to sell the wares, often after paying a stall fee to the town authorities. Market rules dictate where outsiders can sell. He might be assigned to a section of the square reserved for non-local traders. Once the market opens, the merchant becomes a showman and negotiator. He lays out bright strips of cloth and shiny trinkets to catch the eyes of those who pass by. He calls out in a loud voice to potential customers, praising the quality of his goods. Medieval shoppers, well, they expect a bargain too. So a back and forth over price, that's all part of the job. The merchant might accept barter deals too. Well, for example, trading a length of cloth for a farmer's tub of butter, or a dozen eggs, if coin is scarce. In these dealings, quick wits and a reputation for fair dealing serve him well. He's learned it over years of experience. But if he's known to sell faulty goods or cheat on measurements, word will spread. People will avoid him. Local authorities and guilds, well, they keep a close watch on any visiting merchants. Sure, they're welcome, because they bring wares that the locals want. But as long as they don't undercut the local shopkeepers or violate town regulations, play by the rules. A common restriction across Europe was against forestalling. We've mentioned it briefly. A merchant couldn't intercept producers from outside the market, buy up all the goods before others had a chance. If he tried to buy all of the fisherman's catch on the road and sell it at a higher price, he'd definitely be punished for forestalling, since the practice makes the market dearer to the fair trader. He also might face rules that he cannot sell certain goods directly to consumers if a local guild had already claimed the privilege. For instance, in some towns a traveling cloth seller could only sell wholesale to local drapers, not retail to the public, except during big fairs. Navigating these laws required a good bit of savvy. Successful merchants learned to cooperate with local guilds, sometimes by paying a small fee or offering guild members the first pick of the best goods. But all in all, the life of a small merchant, it was filled with uncertainty. Profits could be good at a bustling fair one week, but they could be disappointingly low at a poorly attended village market the next. There was never any certainty. And then there were the seasonal challenges. In winter, travel became difficult on snow-clogged or muddy roads. Many peddlers stayed put in towns, Perhaps they took on odd jobs or sold off any remaining stock. During planting or harvest seasons, country folk had little time or money for commerce, you see. So a merchant might focus on selling in towns or plan his circuit around the agricultural calendar. And to survive long term, these merchants built their own networks. They got to know friendly innkeepers along the routes, for safe lodging and for storage, and they often traded information and even goods with one another. For example, one peddler might agree to carry another's wares to villages he passes through, acting as each other's agent in different areas. They also relied on credit networks. A merchant might obtain goods from an urban supplier on credit, paying after he sells them, and that requires trust on both sides. If he proved reliable in making payments, the supplier would continue to extend merchandise on credit, allowing him to keep his inventory stocked. Some small merchants eventually saved enough to settle down and open permanent shops in towns, the dream for most of them. A traveling spice seller might, for instance, establish himself as a local grower in a market town, joining the Merchants' Guild there. This was one path of upward mobility, turning an itinerant trade into a rooted business. Many, however, just spent their lives on the road. Their livelihood depended on their mobility and knowledge, knowing which villages held market day on which days, what local people needed, and what they could afford. Also where to source their goods at a cheap price. At the end of a market day, a merchant would pack up any unsold wares. He counts the day's coins, perhaps even a mix of currency. Medieval money was not uniform. You might be paid in English silver pennies, French deniers, or local tokens, and he has to know their values. After paying his dues and expenses, he hides the remaining coins on his person for the journey home, or perhaps the journey onward. Then, onward he moves, ever in search of the next opportunity. It's a life of constant motion and hustle, but in an age with limited local manufacturing, these small merchants provided goods and connection. By the trade of their wits and wares, they made a respectable living, and knit together the economies of town and countryside. Of course, I don't think I need to say it. Running a small business in medieval times was not without serious challenges. Economic swings could make or break a business. Since most people's income depended on agriculture, a bad harvest or famine meant customers had very little money to spend. A baker or a tailor might see sales plummet in a lean year. Prices of raw materials could also spike. For example, if wheat became very expensive, brewers and bakers struggled to afford grain. In such times, craftspeople resorted to survival strategies, like mixing cheaper ingredients, though remember they risked punishment of getting caught, or pivoting to repair work and services that cost less to provide. Many artisans kept small garden plots or livestock to help feed their families when cash was scarce. Diversification of income was a medieval necessity. A smith might also farm a bit of land. A weaver's wife might brew ale for extra income. An innkeeper might also raise chickens for eggs to sell. They're all pretty good ideas. Multiple small sidelines to supplement the main business. Another constant thread was fire or disease. Now, you see, towns, they were a dense tinderbox of wooden buildings and open hearths. A workshop could burn down in minutes if a spark caught. Artisans took precautions, like keeping water nearby, but citywide fires, they weren't uncommon. And guess what? There was no insurance. Often only the help came from neighbors or the guild pitching in to get the craftsman back on his feet. Illness was equally devastating. If a master fell ill or died, his family would struggle to keep the business running. The Black Death of the 14th century tragically wiped out many small businesses overnight. But on the other hand, those who survived a plague sometimes found less competition afterwards and could earn more. But, of course, there was cold comfort amidst such loss. Financial liquidity was a perennial concern. Small businesses usually operated on thin margins, often relying on credit. They might buy raw materials on credit or allow trusted customers to buy on credit, which created chains of IOUs. If too many debtors defaulted or a big payment to the business was delayed, the owner could end up unable to pay his own obligations. Medieval court records are full of disputes over unpaid debts, in some cases debtors even being jailed. To manage this risk, business owners tried to build relationships of trust. An established merchant might have a standing arrangement with a supplier to pay after goods were sold, each trusting the other to settle accounts in time. Family ties were also used to secure credit. For instance, an in-law or wealthy cousin might lend money in a pinch. Some entrepreneurs formed partnerships to pool resources and spread risk, two merchants investing in a venture together, so that if it failed, the loss was shared. But perhaps the most important survival strategy was maintaining a good reputation. In a world without modern advertising, that was everything. Medieval advice books often counseled merchants to be truthful and fair dealing for this very reason. Cheating a customer even once would completely ruin you, while fair dealing, that could attract a lot of new customers. And so medieval entrepreneurs relied on community support. Being part of the guild meant that in hard times, say if you were if you were sick rather, or had some accident in the workshop, fellow guild members might help the family out or extend credit. Some guilds had funds to aid members in need. Everybody chipped in a little bit just in case. And religious fraternities associated with trades also provided charity. Medieval thinking on economics, the doctrine of the just price taught by theologians like Aquinas, discouraged extreme profiteering and urged that commerce be used to serve the common good. And so, in short, medieval entrepreneurs had to be adaptable and resilient. They saved profits from good seasons to survive in bad ones, juggled multiple products or jobs, leaned on family and guild network in crises, and strove to maintain both the quality of the goods along with the goodwill of their community, at the same time trying to make a profit. Those who managed to do all this stood the best chance of weathering the inevitable storms, be they economic downturns, social upheavals, accidents, and perhaps, if they were lucky, they could hand down their trade to the next generation. And so the daily realities of running a business in these times were a mix of craftsmanship, regulation, risk, and community. We've seen how a baker or smith would rise before dawn, how a tavern keeper dealt with drunkards and inspectors, and how a peddler haggled in the marketplace. These small enterprises were the backbone of medieval town life, providing the essential goods and services, bread, ale, cloth, shoes, all the things people needed, long before anything like factories or large-scale enterprises existed. These entrepreneurs had to balance the drive for profit with the expectations of their society. Earning a living meant that you had to diligently follow guild rules, along with local laws, but also innovating enough and working hard enough to stand out. It was all about building trust. An honest reputation was as valuable as gold. In an era where transactions were face-to-face, personal integrity and relationships often determined your success. As theologian Thomas Aquinas and others insisted, commerce had to be fair and sustainable, a sentiment that medieval guilds and market courts reinforced in practice. And so, throughout our time together today, we've heard from some of those voices, from the regulations to Marguerite Kemp's candid memoirs, failing to make that beer. They paint a pretty interesting picture, and I hope that a vivid image has been put into your mind. These kinds of sources, they show a world where authorities might drag a cheating baker through the streets with dough around his neck, or where a determined woman could briefly prosper as a brewer, only to see the entire enterprise fall down with one bad batch. But they also show proud artisans celebrating their craft and markets bustling with energy and opportunity. While the Middle Ages are often remembered for kings and knights and wars, it was people like the diligent artisan, the savvy tavern keeper, and the resourceful merchant who kept daily life running in the background. The challenges, meeting regulations, pleasing customers, surviving economic swings, they're all challenges that echo small business owners even today. It's all beautifully human, and all the strategies to deal with it, cooperation, quality, honesty, and adaptability, well, they're timeless too. And so, in the end, running a business in medieval times was not just about practical skill, but really social intelligence and resilience. Success was never guaranteed. It's the same in business today. But those who managed to thrive did so only by weaving together the economic with the social. They respected the rules and needs of their community, even as they pursued their own livelihood with everything they had. The world might seem a little bit distant, but the balance they struck between self-interest and the common good, well, that's a theme that continues to resonate in the story of commerce. It's interesting. We really haven't changed that much. Well, I'd like to thank you for joining me today. I think we've had fun. This video was suggested, so I thought that I'd do it. And we've all had a good time, I hope. I assume you have, since you are still listening at this point. Now let me thank the top-tier patrons and supporters: Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfitnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Star Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, and Talbury. Thank you so much. And if you've enjoyed it, then let me know in the comments. Hit the like and the subscribe. You know what to do. And until next time, I wish you all the best. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.